Hi there, welcome to my talk on the Identity Threat Assessment Framework. My name is Simon Moffat. I am CEO and research analyst at an organization called the Cyberhut, and we track all of the emerging trends and vendors in the global identity and access management space. And one part of that process is looking at research, things like frameworks, things like best practices around how organizations can apply identity technology. And it's an honor and a thrill to be here today at the IAM Tech Day to give a little bit of an introduction to what we believe every organization should really be using to try and reduce risk and reduce specifically identity risk within their ecosystems. Let me start briefly by looking at some of the problems that we're all facing in the identity and access management space. The first one is identity has now become really foundational to business success. It really is the key to business collaboration, data sharing, supply chains, joint ventures, consumer identity, the delivery of services and products in a digital transformation project. So, identity is key to allowing the business to function. But equally, identity is foundational to security. Concepts like zero trust, identity centric security, they all rely on having a very strong authentication and authorization backbone. Unfortunately, the identity infrastructure, though, is becoming more fragmented. We have silos of identity data within premise, within on premises directories. We have a multitude of different MFA components. We have to deal with cloud identity, SaaS services, trying to gain access to SaaS services. So we suddenly have a very fragmented identity data infrastructure, all communicating in different languages, in different models, using different terminology, and often owned by different people in the organization too. Fourthly, identity risk has traditionally been focused on detection, looking for indicators of compromise, looking at identity perhaps from a compliance initiative or perhaps from an IGA perspective, very detective. And unfortunately, identity threat assessment, management modeling is very inconsistent. There are no real mature models around analyzing identity threats, how you assess risk, how you treat identity threats. And that really is contributing to a whole host of different issues within the enterprise. And that's really resulting in the spaghetti image here, which is essentially identity threat now is being distributed across the five W's: the who, the where, why, when, and what. And unfortunately, very, very difficult. It's finding it very difficult to manage this spaghetti in the middle. And this really is amplifying a level of threat across all parts of the identity infrastructure, which is why we need to start thinking about identity threat in a slightly different way. I think now, as identity has reached a level of maturity and complexity, and we need to start thinking about threat across this entire identity lifecycle. So, how can we start to tackle this, and how can we start to think about the identity threat landscape in a somewhat different way? Well, the first sort of three problems, if you like, the business success, identity as part of security, and this fragmented ecosystem, they're really all part of the natural maturity of identity and access management. The technology, the processes, the personnel, the procedures involved within identity have led us to this position where we have a very broad and distributed set of vendors, solution providers, and identity types. And that is something we have to deal with as an industry. But I think the other two parts we can be in control of. And the first one is trying to move the identity risk from being something we go and look for to something we have to try and prevent. We're trying to left shift the risk focus really into a more preventative model. And this will allow the business to see more success from a controls perspective, a return on investment from a software perspective, and essentially reduce risk in general across the enterprise. The threat assessment process really should look to leverage existing risk models. Maybe the NIST risk management framework. We have the NIST cybersecurity framework. We have things like ISO 27001. We have multiple models of looking at generic risk, and we really need to start taking some of those and extending with our specialist knowledge of identity and access management, and trying to enhance those models and apply the correct assessment and treatment frameworks to our specific identity ecosystems. So, what is an identity threat assessment framework? Well, essentially, we're starting to introduce the concept of being able to identify and treat identity risk across a whole host of different identity types, from employees within the workforce to consumers, IoT, things, devices, as well as machines. And I think these four major pillars really are different levels of maturity, of course. But every time we are looking to maybe deliver a new consumer project, deliver a new API or a new IoT project, we need to be thinking how we can analyze threat across that entire identity ecosystem. And how do we do this? We'll look to start identifying threat locations, be that identity, the persistence layer, the authentication layer, authorization, etc., and look to have a catalog of example controls or preemptive risk reduction controls that we can apply to the various parts of our identity life cycles. And that could well be leveraging existing controls from ISO or from OWASP or from MITRE, but taking those controls and having them baked into our identity life cycles from the beginning of their inception. And the idea really is we have to start thinking about applying our threat assessment model to all parts of this identity lifecycle. And these generic components here could apply to consumers. It could be an employee gaining access to an internal database. It could be an IoT project where the who actually becomes a device, and the what could well be maybe a cloud service, for example. But we have to break down those identity journeys into the who, the where, the why, when, and what, and then look to apply threat analysis against each of those components. And the way we look to do that, we look to essentially again take the best parts of existing risk management, and that essentially allows us to look at this sort of four-step process where, first of all, we're looking to identify some of our identity assets, and those assets could clearly be things like identity information, permission information, the devices these identities are using, the runtime evaluation that's being used, and so on. So looking to identify the components across our employee or consumer life cycles, and then we look to model those access paths. An access path simply being the combination of those W's, the who, where, what, why, when, etc., and look to model out what this identity is trying to do under which conditions. And once we have that, we can then start to apply our standard controls. And those controls could be something as simple as making sure MFA has been enrolled, perhaps things like removing accounts that have not been logged in for 90 days, perhaps identifying permissions that have been assigned to a user but have yet to be used. So starting to move to this concept of zero standing privileges, for example. So there's lots of individual, very specific controls that could be applied to that particular identity access path. And of course, step four is the important aspect. We're looking to identify exceptions, then have a model to treat those exceptions, be that through mitigation, transfer, avoidance, or acceptance, etc. And the amplification again is around the who. Who should we apply this to? And we have a multitude of different identity types, and within those identity types, we then have a very big what, if you like. What identity assets do we wish to analyze from a threat assessment process? Why should we do this? Well, the benefits really seem to be significant. This is basically research we've done with our sort of industry advisory board and some of the clients we've worked with in industry. But there seem to be four main personas who would benefit. Number one is risk. The risk teams looking to essentially take their existing risk models and apply very specific identity assessment, analysis, and treatment options. The security architecture team, they want to essentially identify and justify the selection of specific security controls, be that from ISO or be that from maybe the Center for Internet Security or NIST or whatever it could be. The digital teams, it helps them to identify journey components. So, for example, how you would perhaps enroll during a banking application with your mobile phone, and helping to look at those who, what, when, why characteristics, then looking to apply threat analysis across each of those stages to help discover and develop those digital journeys in a better way. And the audit teams, they essentially want to have some more detailed steps involved when performing things like as is assessments, or more like a pen test for identity, if you like, to help them with the various different steps and processes within their sort of security slash audit journey against the identity infrastructure, which can often be quite inconsistent and quite detached really from the original design of the identity project. That brings us to the end. That was a very brief introduction, really. I think that the really key takeaway is to start thinking that actually identity is now at a level of maturity where we have to start thinking about risk and threat across the entire identity ecosystem. We have to start thinking about threat across different identity types. We also need to start thinking about applying default controls to our identity projects at a much earlier part of the design lifecycle. And CyberHut is working on this thing called the Identity Threat Assessment Framework. And it's something that all organizations are really looking to leverage as they go on their identity journey and reach a level of maturity where they can look to try and remove threat and reduce their risk exposure as well. Hope you enjoyed it. Please reach out to me directly at the CyberHut for any questions or comments. Love to hear any of your stories around threat assessment in the identity world. Hope you enjoy the rest of today, and thank you for listening.